could be extant, meaning they are currently living. But we also have to consider organisms that were once living but are now extinct. When we look at the variety of organisms on Earth, we do need to consider both extinct and extant organisms. And so when we look at all the living organisms that are on Earth, we might want to group them according to their similarities. And so we have a couple different ways to do that. The main way that we do it is we look at something called phylogeny, which is the study of evolutionary relationships. So when we look at a phylogenetic tree, we've usually seen it that looks kind of like this, a fairly basic phylogenetic tree. But this is actually a phylogenetic tree of about 3,000 organisms. It turns out there are over 8 million different organisms that exist, 8 million different species that exist either extantly or extinctly. And so it starts to get really confusing. Where did all of this diversity come from? So keep in mind, speciation really represents diversity. So where did all of these different species come from? And what led to this is actually something called adaptive radiation. And adaptive radiation is very similar to the word that we know called divergent evolution. So, if we think about this idea of divergent evolution means that we started with one organism, and that there was diversity in that one organism. And so we can start to see different diverse forms of that organism, but each of those might branch into multiple diverse organisms as well. And this concept that we started with one organism and we've adapted over time, we're going to talk about this word adapt in just a second, that we've adapted over time, and this has resulted in this radiation that leads to all of these different organisms. And so this phylogenetic tree actually represents our 6 kingdoms, animals and plants and fungi and protists and archaebacteria and eubacteria. It's the idea that we could have started as just one cell and we could have changed dramatically over time. Now this idea of time is really important. So adaptive radiation. Let's talk for just a second about what an adaptation is. An adaptation is a genetic trait that helps survival. Now keep in mind, it has to be genetic because we're talking about speciation, we're talking about evolution. It had to change over time. So when we mean that time, we do have to keep in mind that we're talking about what sort of time frame. And the time frame for speciation, how long did all of this take? How did this happen? The time frame really depends on reproduction. So how long does reproduction take? And it depends on environmental conditions. If the environment is very constant over time, we actually see very slow rates of speciation. If the environment is changing drastically over time, then we'll usually see higher rates of speciation. Reproduction comes into play as well. If the organism reproduces very slowly, we're going to see lower rates of speciation. If the reproduction occurs more quickly, we see higher rates of speciation. We also have to keep in mind variation. So these are kind of the three components that lead to speciation, lead to adaptive radiation. The idea that we could start with one organism and the variety in that one organism could result in a very large diversity of existing organisms. And so what we really want to do is understand that there is evidence to support that as we change over time, we can become different species. We talked about the mechanisms that lead to that, pre-zygotic and post-zygotic. But we really can understand how adaptive radiation resulted in all of these different species. What we want to do is take just a little bit of time to look at this idea of a time frame and look at environmental conditions in terms of looking at all of the life on Earth. So biodiversity, all the different life forms on Earth. So what we need to do is actually look a little bit at the geologic time scale. And so what we start to see, and we'll look at a couple different sources of this in class, what we start to see is that using radiometric dating, so the geologic time scale uses radiometric dating to tie the age of fossils with events on Earth. So tomorrow we will look at the 5 major extinctions that have occurred in Earth's history, but we want a little bit of history on Earth just to get started. So when we date parts of the Earth's core, it turns out that 3,500 million years ago is the oldest microfossils. But it is believed that the Earth is about 3.6 billion years old. So the first fossils that we have found are from about 3,500 million years ago, so about 3.5 million years ago. Million years ago are the oldest fossils, but the Earth is much older than that. So one of the things we'll look at is, where did these first cells come from? Where did the very first cells have evolved from? And then we start to see the idea that we have the first eukaryotes, and then we start to see multicellular organisms. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at is, when did Earth first form? When is the record of the first cells, the first eukaryotic cells, the first multicellular organisms, and then how has Earth changed over those 3.6 billion years? We've actually seen multiple mass extinction events, and we want to look at how that has shaped the organisms that live today on Earth. What we want to do is just take a little bit of time right now to talk about this very first cell. There are multiple theories for where life on Earth came from. The one that we're going to really focus on is the evolution of the first cell from non-living molecules to a living cell. And this is actually called abiogenesis. Now, for a very long period of history, it was believed that life just sprang into being, that babies dropped down from storks, that fish came out from the mud of a pond. And so abiogenesis kind of has a negative connotation to it, because we now know that life currently comes from other living organisms. So one thing that we do need to keep in mind is that currently life comes from pre-existing life. life from pre-existing life. And this is called biogenesis. And even though it sounds like biogenesis and abiogenesis are opposites, they really go together in the minds of many scientists. Many scientists believe that the first living cells came from non-living molecules, and that was abiogenesis, the origin of the first cell. But that those cells had to be able to reproduce, and that now we have biogenesis. So abiogenesis would explain how life begins. Biogenesis would explain how life continues. So what we want to do is look at what early Earth was like and determine, could cells have come from this very early Earth? So there are a few things we need to know about the conditions of early Earth. Early Earth was very unstable. We had unstable weather. We had unstable geological conditions, meaning we had lots of earthquakes, right? We had those shifting plates tectonics. We had lots of earthquakes. We had lots of volcanoes. So very unstable. But this is also representative of very high amounts of energy. So lots of energy coming from the sun, lots of energy coming from the plate tectonics. The other thing is that we did not have very much of an atmosphere. So we had very little atmosphere. And keep in mind, atmosphere are going to be free gases. And the main thing that we were lacking in our atmosphere was oxygen. There were gases in the atmosphere, but oxygen was at very, very low levels. But we did have a fair amount of water, we had a fair amount of heat. And so early Earth's conditions had very unstable and high amounts of energy, and we also had very little atmospheric O2. What we did see is that fossils show us that we can form organic molecules. And we're going to watch a little video on that tomorrow. How do we form organic molecules without a cell? Right now, if you want to form a carbohydrate, we need a photosynthetic organism or chemosynthetic organism. We need something to make that sugar or make that starch. But it turns out that if you set up an apparatus, you can actually build amino acids, nucleotides, carbohydrates, and lipids all spontaneously. So what we're going to look at tomorrow is, how does this happen spontaneously? So we have some theories from a man named Urey, who had the primordial soup theory. Primordial soup. Sorry for my pen. Primordial soup theory. And that was the theory that you could form organic molecules without any sort of cells. So how would we test this? I'm sorry, this was operin. I'm really sorry. I had a little brain fart. Operin. O-P-A-R-I-N. Operin. Miller and Urey actually did the testing. They did the very first testing of this, and they did get amino acids and other inorganic compounds. So what they set up was an experiment where we had energy to represent lightning, we had water, we had gases, and they were able to form amino acids and other organic compounds. And so what they found when they tested is that from non-living, we could form molecules. So they really supported Operin's theory of primordial soup, that the very first molecules could have formed spontaneously. But forming molecules is a long way away from actually forming a cell and forming life. And so one of the things that we have to keep in mind is, how old is the Earth? How long did these conditions go on for? And that's where we'll stop.